Okay, so in this video I'd like to look at the first page of Margaret Atwood's story Happy Endings that I've assigned for you, and as I did with the Intro to Fiction video, I also want to show you just how I've annotated this particular text, at least the first page of it, and kind of run through it with you, what I saw was significant, just to kind of give you a model for active reading. So you'll notice that I made a lot of notes regarding the author's background. One of the things that we learned from the Intro to Fiction section was that it's really, really difficult to separate the author's understanding of his or her time and place with the story that the author is telling. The particular type of criticism that this is new historicism. And it's how I tend to read. I tend to think about things like this. So that's why my particular annotation is heavy in that section. So I made the note here that she is Canadian. And I've asked myself, like, what is the impact of that? You'll notice that I ask more questions here than I answer. And that's my strategy for being an active reader, because as I go through and read the text, that's when I come to those answers, hopefully, or at least I continue to think about it. The idea that she's equally skilled as a poet and a fiction writer kind of made me wonder, like, well, how is that going to, how are those skill sets the same? Is it, as we learned in the Intro to Fiction, that, that writing a piece of short fiction that's really eloquent and well said is just as hard as being a poet? Am I going to see elements of her poetry writing in her story? And I think we certainly do. The idea that she's a feminist almost just gives me the shivers a bit, just because, as I note here, what does that mean? We notice that Margaret Atwood was born in 1939. The fact that it doesn't have a death date indicates that she's still alive. How has feminism changed within her lifetime? When did she write this story? The thing about feminism, and the reason why it makes me itch here, is just because it has changed so much over time, and I think feminism means different things to different people. And so the idea that she's, a feminist spokesperson, it just kind of makes me think, and she was, the Woman of the Year in 1986. Well, 1986 was a very different time for women, in Canada and America, anywhere really. So it just kind of, that gave me a pause for thinking about that right there, and just kind of wondering, how is that going to impact the story? How does that impact my reading of the story? Is she writing with a sort of feminist agenda? Or, could it be read that way? And I think with this particular story, that's one of the things that you kind of wonder, like, well, who is she siding with here? The note that I make at the very end, that she's, this is a experimentation here, the critiques of the male-female relationship, and I ask, what's her conclusion? Because I kind of want to relate that back to this idea of feminism, the idea that, it's a fundamentalist patriarchy that's controlling things. And so I had a lot of questions based on this background going into the story itself. And after I read the story, I went back and I reflected on some of these things. And, I'm not saying that I have like 100% conclusions. However, it increased the reading that I did, in the sense that it was more critically based. It helped me with my analysis to understand where she was coming from. So let's look at the actual story. The idea of the title is significant. I always look at the title. Why did she title this Happy Endings? Well, happy ending is just such a relative term. The idea of happiness itself is just so relative. What makes one person happy doesn't necessarily make someone else happy. The idea here that happiness could be a universal, I think, is almost insulting, and it almost oversimplifies the notion of happiness. Like, if you don't have a husband and 2.5 children and a white picket fence and all those things, that you can't be happy, and looking at her author background, it makes me wonder, well, did she do this for that particular purpose? You know, to highlight for people that we do have this notion of happiness that is kind of antiquated, and it's not necessarily, you know, the reality for a lot of people. Also, the idea of endings. Maybe it's just my personal understanding of this, or my personal belief with it, but it's kind of like if one thing ends, something else begins. And I think as I was reading through the story, the notion of the ending itself struck me, because her story really isn't about the ending, right? It's about the journey to get you there. The idea that it starts with these generic names, John and Mary, certainly, you know, I kind of noted that those are basic and generic. It's meant to be universal. And in 2015, when I'm reading this, I'm thinking, what about, you know, John and Gary meeting? Or, you know, so again, there's just not a lot of flexibility in this, and maybe that is exactly the point that she was trying to make. The idea, what happens next, leads us to this expectation that something has to happen. You know, just because you meet someone of an opposite sex doesn't mean that you have to have a relationship with them, or that the relationship has to evolve, or whatever. You know, I met a guy in Walmart tonight, and he spoke to me, and I was like, hello, you know, he had a question about where something was. Our relationship is absolutely over. You know what I mean? Like, I helped him find his chips, and then we moved on with life. So I think the idea of what happens next, there's this pressure that something has to happen next, that a relationship has to evolve, because in order to be happy, again, you have to have the marriage, you have to have the kids, you've got to do all these things. So what I did in the actual story under A here is that I just kind of highlighted the attributes of happiness that I think Atwood is getting at here: love, married, jobs, house, live-in help, children, all those kinds of things. And I put a question mark next to it, and it's leading me to question, what are the attributes of happiness according to me? Is Atwood putting these forth as, you know, her reality? Is she putting them forth in a sarcastic way? Is she trying to make a point? You know, what is the purpose that she's using here in order to have this be A? I very much enjoy this story. I think it really shows you how clever and how closely crafted some of these stories can be. I also think that it's a great reminder to many of us that when you read something quickly, you get the main point, but you don't get the real meat of it, okay? So if you were just reading this story quickly and you're like, okay, this was ending A, this is ending B, this is, you know, whatever, you get the plot movement in a sense, but you don't get the bigger picture. And what I'm hoping that you guys can handle in this class, and that I want to promote through the activities and the discussions and things like that, is that critical level of analysis. So please take your time, go through the text as you're reading it, ask yourself questions, make notes to yourself. Why is she doing this? Why is the author putting this in these terms? How do I feel about this? What connections can I make to it? Things like that. Happy reading.